Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? Let's talk homesteading. But not the old-timey farm image, We're going to go
Yeah.
deeper and figure out what modern homesteading really is. Why are so many people into it these days? And how can it work, no matter where you live or what your life is like? You might be surprised by what we find.
Well, homesteading, it's got this super interesting history, like way back to the Homestead Act of 1862. Can you imagine
Yeah,
the government just giving you free land if you promise to farm it? Talk about self-sufficiency. That idea of taking care of yourself, that's still the heart of homesteading, even though, things have definitely changed since then.
yeah, for sure. It's not just about those huge farms anymore. It's kind of cool. I was looking at your sources, Hyla, and they talk about how people are homesteading on a smaller scale, even in cities. I'm really curious to hear more about that. But before we get into the different types of homesteading, let's talk about the basics, right? The three core principles: self-sufficiency, simplicity, and sustainability. First up, self-sufficiency. It's not about, ditching society and going off the grid completely.
Yeah.
It's more about having more control over the things you need and use every day.
Exactly. It's all about being resourceful and independent. Think about it. Growing your own food, raising chickens, even doing DIY projects around the house. It makes you ask, how much could I actually do myself?
Hmm.
There's even research on this. People who do things like gardening or home repairs, they actually say they feel more capable, more resilient in other parts of their lives too.
Oh, yeah, that totally makes sense. It's like having a sense of control, being the master of your own little world.
Exactly. And that idea of simplifying your world. Well, that brings us to our next principle, simplicity. And this one's super relevant right now with everyone into minimalism and all that. It's not about having tons of stuff. It's about quality, not quantity.
For sure. And the sources you found really highlight how homesteading is all about that.
Hmm.
Simplifying life, not making it more complicated with a bunch of junk you don't need. There's this article about families who embraced minimalism,
Yeah,
and they said they felt less stressed and more connected as a family.
that's so interesting. It seems like when you simplify your physical space,
Wow.
it kind of spills over into your mental and emotional well-being too. And you know what? This ties right into our final principle, sustainability, living in harmony with nature, minimizing our impact, you know?
Yeah. This is something I'm really passionate about. Composting, using renewable energy, homesteading has so many ways to help us be better to the planet. One of your sources even talked about how people are bringing back old school food preservation techniques, like canning and fermenting. It's like connecting with our past, but also being smart about food waste and self-reliance.
And what's cool about those old techniques, they're not just good for the environment, they're good for you too. Fermented foods, they're full of probiotics, super healthy for your gut.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's like we're rediscovering these ancient practices
Yeah.
and realizing they have so much to offer. Okay, so we've covered the three core principles of homesteading: self-sufficiency, simplicity, and sustainability. But, what does homesteading actually look like in real life? I mean, it's not just one thing, right?
You got it. Modern homesteading, it comes in different flavors, each with its own personality and appeal. We can basically break it down into three main types: rural homesteading, suburban homesteading, and urban homesteading.
Okay.
Let's start with the classic image, the one everyone thinks of first: rural homesteading.
Already picturing it. Those beautiful countryside scenes with big gardens, chickens running around. It's
Mhm.
this amazing sense of peace and quiet that you just can't find in the city.
That's the dream, right? And for good reason. Rural homesteading is all about immersing yourself in nature,
Hmm.
working with the land, creating this self-sustaining ecosystem. But one of the sources you gave me, it was a memoir by this experienced homesteader, and they emphasized that it's not always as perfect as it seems.
Oh, really? What kind of challenges did they talk about?
Well, they said you got to be ready for anything. Nature, it can be unpredictable. Stuff like bad weather or pests, they can really mess with your crops and animals. They said rural homesteading takes a lot of knowledge about the land, hard work, and being able to adapt when things change.
Right, it makes sense. It's not just about living this romantic off-grid life. It's about being resourceful, tough, and always learning.
Yeah.
But what about people who, aren't ready to leave the city completely? That's where suburban homesteading comes in, right?
Exactly. It's like getting the best of both worlds. You can still have your backyard garden full of fresh veggies, some chickens laying eggs, a strong sense of community in your neighborhood,
Yeah.
and you still have access to all the city stuff too.
Sounds like a pretty great balance.
Yeah.
One of your sources profiled this family who turned their suburban backyard into a homestead. They have chickens, beehives, they even collect rainwater, and they built a little greenhouse so they can grow vegetables all year round. They said it brought them closer as a family, taught them useful skills, and even save them money on groceries.
That's a perfect example of how suburban homesteading can really enrich your life. It shows you don't need tons of land to benefit from this lifestyle. And speaking of making the most of limited space, let's talk about the most unexpected type of homesteading: urban homesteading.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. How do you even homestead in a city? With all the concrete and buildings and not much green space.
This is where people get super creative and resourceful. Rooftop gardens, vertical gardening systems, growing things in containers on balconies, even community plots shared by people living in apartments.
Wow, so it's like finding those little pockets of nature and making the most of every inch you have. There's this one urban homesteader in one of your sources, and she grows a ton of food on her tiny apartment balcony. She uses vertical gardening and all kinds of repurposed containers.
She even has a hydroponic system inside for herbs and greens. It just goes to show you, you don't need a big farm to embrace this lifestyle.
That's so inspiring. It proves that anyone can do this, no matter where they live.
Exactly. It's about seeing the potential even in the most unlikely places. So whether you're drawn to the peacefulness of rural life, the balance of the suburbs, or the cleverness of urban homesteading, there are these key elements that connect them all, and you find those elements in the homesteading toolkit.
Huh.
These are the skills and practices that let you create a more self-sufficient and sustainable life. And it all starts with the most basic thing: food production.
Okay, food production. So it's not just about planting a few tomatoes in your backyard. Right? Your sources talked about some really cool ways people are producing food, from raising livestock to foraging for wild edibles. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, it goes way beyond just a little garden. One of the sources, it was a guide to modern homesteading. It talked about these food forests. It's like you design your garden to be like a natural forest with different layers of plants all helping each other out. Super cool way to use your space well and make your food source more resilient.
That's amazing. It's so cool how homesteading encourages us to learn from nature. Okay, so we're growing all this amazing food, but what do we do with it all? That brings us to food preservation. That's got to be super important for homesteaders, right?
Totally. It's about making that harvest last, you know?
Yeah.
Making sure you have good food to eat all year round. Your sources talked about all kinds of methods: canning, dehydrating, fermenting, freezing. It's like capturing the taste of summer and saving it for winter.
Oh, I remember this one article you shared. It was all about this thing called lacto fermentation.
Hmm.
Just use salt and water to preserve vegetables.
Hmm.
And it's not just about making the food last longer. It also creates those good bacteria probiotics that are good for your gut.
Right. People have been doing lacto fermentation for centuries all over the world,
Yeah.
and it's making a comeback because people are getting more into natural food preservation and healthy eating. It's amazing how these old techniques are still relevant today.
I know. It's like we're rediscovering the wisdom of our ancestors. Okay, we've covered growing food and preserving it. Now let's talk about animal husbandry. I can just picture those cute little backyard chickens laying fresh eggs every morning.
Chickens are definitely popular. And it makes sense. They're not too hard to take care of. They give you fresh eggs, and they can even help get rid of pests in your garden. But homesteading isn't just about chickens. Your sources mention people raising goats for milk, sheep for wool, rabbits for meat and fur, even bees for honey.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like having a mini farm right in your backyard. But that comes with a lot of responsibility, right? You got to really take care of those animals.
Sure. There was this book you gave me on ethical animal husbandry, and it stressed how important it is to understand what each animal needs, giving them the right shelter, food, and health care, and making sure they have enough space to move around and be themselves, you know?
That's so important. It's about respecting those animals
Yeah.
and knowing they're not just there for our benefit. It's about taking care of them, not just using them.
Exactly. It's about living up to your values, making sure the animals are treated right. Okay, so we've talked about food production, food preservation, and animal husbandry. Now let's dive into another big part of homesteading: sustainable living.
This is where it goes beyond just a set of skills.
Yeah.
It becomes a whole philosophy, right? A way of life that's all about minimizing our impact on the planet.
Exactly. Your sources were full of different sustainable practices: composting, rainwater harvesting, renewable energy, reducing waste. It's about creating a way of life that's more cyclical, more regenerative.
I remember reading this article about building a biogas digester. It uses food scraps and animal manure to make methane gas, which you can then use for cooking and heating. Turning waste into energy? That's genius.
Right. Homesteaders are always innovating, coming up with ways to be less dependent on outside resources. They're always at the forefront of exploring new energy sources and waste management systems.
It's like this constant cycle of learning, trying new things, and adapting to create a more sustainable and self-reliant life. And you know what else is great about homesteading? making your own stuff, like soap, candles, clothes, furniture, all kinds of things.
Yeah, the maker spirit is huge in the homesteading world. Your sources were full of examples. Woodworking, blacksmithing, knitting, sewing. It's like bringing back these old skills that people used to know, but that have kind of disappeared in our modern consumerist society.
One of the books you gave me was about this homesteader who learned to spin her own wool from her sheep and then knit it into sweaters and blankets. It's amazing.
Okay.
She's creating something beautiful and useful from resources she raised herself.
It shows you how satisfying and empowering it can be to create things, not just buy them. It's about valuing quality and craftsmanship instead of mass production.
It's like pushing back against this throwaway culture we've gotten used to. Okay, so we've talked about all the different parts of the homesteading lifestyle. But what is it that attracts people to this way of life? Why are so many people suddenly interested in homesteading?
That's a great question. Everyone has their own reasons, but there are some common themes that run through their stories. One of the biggest things that came up in your sources was this longing for connection. Connection to nature, to where their food comes from, to their community, even to themselves.
I get that in this crazy busy world, it's easy to feel disconnected from nature and even from ourselves. Homesteading seems like a way to slow down, to get back in touch with the rhythms of nature, and to rediscover the simple joy of creating things with your own hands.
You nailed it. One of the sources is a bunch of essays by homesteaders, and they talked about how spending time in nature, taking care of plants and animals, and doing physical work really helps their mental and emotional health. It's like therapy, a way to reconnect with our instincts and find peace and purpose.
That's beautiful. It's like homesteading helps us find our way back to ourselves, to a more authentic way of living. And I bet that feeling of self-sufficiency and resilience is a big part of it too, especially in a world that feels so uncertain these days.
Absolutely. With all the economic ups and downs, climate change, political stuff, people want to feel more secure, more in control of their lives. Homesteading gives you the power to take care of your own basic needs, to be less reliant on systems, and to feel like you can make a difference, even when things are chaotic.
That makes so much sense. It's like taking back control, being able to provide for yourself and your family. And we can't forget about the environmental aspect.
Yeah.
With everyone worried about climate change, homesteading is a real way to live more sustainably and help protect the planet.
For sure. Your sources talked about how homesteaders are leading the way when it comes to eco-friendly practices, reducing waste, saving water, using renewable energy, supporting local food. They get how everything is connected, and they try to live in a way that respects the planet.
It's like they're showing everyone that it's possible to live more sustainably,
Mm.
even in a world that pushes us to buy more and waste more. But I think a lot of people get intimidated by the idea of homesteading. They think it means you have to change your whole life or be some kind of survival expert to even get started.
Yeah, there are definitely some misconceptions about homesteading. One of your sources, it was a podcast interview with this young woman who homesteads in the city.
Yeah.
And she talked about how she started small, just growing herbs on her windowsill, learning to make her own kombucha. She said homesteading isn't all or nothing. It's about taking little steps that work for your life and slowly learning more as you go.
I love that. It's like giving yourself permission to start wherever you are,
Yeah.
to experiment and learn, and not worry about doing everything perfectly right away.
Exactly. It's about enjoying the journey, not just the destination. And realizing that homesteading isn't about being perfect, it's about making progress, always learning and adapting.
It's about developing that mindset of resilience, resourcefulness, creativity.
Exactly. And it's about connecting with other people who are into the same things, who are passionate about self-sufficiency and sustainable living. There was this blog post by a homesteader who's been doing it for years, and she talked about how important it is to find mentors, join online groups, go to workshops, learn from each other, share knowledge and resources.
That's a great point. Homesteading doesn't have to be a solo thing. It can be a way to connect with people who share your values
Yeah.
and who can support you along the way. But let's be real, there are challenges to homesteading, right? It's not all beautiful sunsets and tons of fresh produce.
True. Homesteading, like anything else, has its tough moments. One of the sources, it was a memoir by this family who left the city to start a homestead, and they were really honest about the struggles they faced, dealing with crazy weather, pests, figuring out how to manage their time and energy. They said homesteading takes a lot of hard work, dedication, and being able to roll with the punches.
It's good to remember that it's not always easy, and you're going to run into some bumps along the way.
Mm.
But it sounds like the rewards can be amazing, both for you personally and for society as a whole.
For sure. Homesteading is a path to becoming more self-sufficient, more resilient, more connected to nature and community. And it's a way to live more sustainably and make a positive impact on the world. But at the end of the day, it's a personal choice.
Right. It's about figuring out what speaks to you, what parts of homesteading you're drawn to, and how you can bring those principles into your own life in your own way.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into homesteading, I want to leave you with something to think about.
What's one small thing you can do today to bring a little bit of that homesteading spirit into your life? Maybe it's planting some herbs on your windowsill,
Uh-huh.
trying to bake bread from scratch, or starting to compost your food scraps.
Those are all great ideas.
Mhm.
And remember, homesteading isn't just about practical skills, it's about developing a mindset of self reliance, resourcefulness, and connection to nature.
You know, one of the things that really stuck with me from all the stuff we talked about is this idea that homesteading is a journey, not a destination. It's about constantly learning, experimenting, and adapting to your situation.
So true. And it's about finding joy in the process. The dirt under your fingernails, the smell of fresh bread in your kitchen, laughing with friends and neighbors as you share tips and tricks. It's about creating a life that feels real, authentic, and aligned with what matters to you.
And it's about realizing that we all have the potential to be homesteaders in our own way, no matter what our circumstances are or how much we know.
Absolutely. You don't need a huge farm or years of experience to embrace the spirit of homesteading. It's a mindset, a way of life that's open to anyone who's curious and willing to learn.
I love that. It's about taking those small steps, making those choices that bring you closer to a life that feels more meaningful and connected to nature.
Homesteading is about taking back our power, our connection to the earth, and our ability to create a more sustainable and fulfilling way of life. It's a journey worth taking, one step at a time.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of homesteading. We hope you feel inspired and ready to start your own homesteading adventure, whether it's big or small. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that homesteading spirit alive.
Until next time, happy homesteading.